The Vorkax battlecruiser Nitrender materialized at the edge of the Maelstrom cluster, a region of space so volatile that its radiation levels and gravitational anomalies had destroyed over 237 exploration vessels in the past decade. Captain Zrelnax gripped the command console, mandible plates clicking with anticipation. His species had conquered this type of environment generations ago, and every new mission was a chance to prove their superiority. The Maelstrom cluster was no ordinary navigational hazard. Quantum instabilities created localized time fractures that could age a ship centuries in moments or compress decades into milliseconds. Gravitational eddies shifted unpredictably, creating spatial distortions that could crush a vessel or fling it across light years in an instant. Most spacefaring civilizations marked this entire sector with warning beacons, a cosmic graveyard that no rational species would dare to approach. But the Vorkax were not most species. Zrelnax's crew represented the pinnacle of evolutionary adaptation. Each member had undergone generations of genetic refinement, their bodies modified to withstand environments that would obliterate lesser life forms. Reinforced exoskeletons, redundant organ systems, neural networks that could process catastrophic sensory input without breaking. They were the galaxy's ultimate survivors, or so they believed. The ship's quantum stabilization field hummed with barely contained energy. Meltok, the primary sensor specialist, manipulated holographic displays that flickered with impossible complexity. Quantum entanglement sensors probed the surrounding space, creating a three-dimensional map that most species couldn't even comprehend. Anomaly detected, Meltok announced, her voice a precise blend of professional calm and underlying tension. There's a vessel. No, that's impossible. Zrelnax leaned forward. The main viewing screen resolved an image that defied everything they understood about survival. A small vessel hung in the midst of spatial chaos, not just surviving, but seemingly comfortable. Its hull bore scars that would have reduced any known spacecraft to fragmented debris. Radiation levels surrounding the ship should have been fatal thousands of times over. The vessel wasn't just intact. It was pristine. Impossible, Zrelnax muttered, repeating Meltok's earlier assessment. But impossibility was a luxury of limited imagination. The Vorkax had built their entire civilization on pushing beyond what other species considered impossible. Quantum cascades danced around the human ship like curious children. Gravitational shears that could compress matter into neutron star density flickered and bent around its hull. The ship didn't just survive. It seemed to negotiate with the fundamental forces of the universe. Meltok's hands moved with surgical precision across her control interface. Preliminary scans are unusual. Hull composition unlike anything in our database. Energy signatures that don't conform to known physics. The vessel appears to be actively managing the environmental hostilities rather than merely defending against them. Zrelnax's secondary neural cluster, the one responsible for threat assessment, began to pulse with an uncomfortable frequency. This wasn't just another exploration. This was something fundamental, a first contact that would rewrite everything they understood about survival. The human vessel showed no signs of distress, no emergency beacon, no desperate communication. It simply existed in a region of space that should have been impossible to inhabit, let alone traverse. Scan again, Zrelnax commanded, a tremor of uncertainty breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. But this time, the command carried a different weight. Not a request born of doubt, but of a growing, visceral curiosity. Something was happening. Something that would challenge everything the Vorkax believed about the nature of adaptation, survival, and the very limits of biological potential. The Maelstrom cluster held its breath. The human vessel waited, and the universe prepared to reveal a secret it had been holding close to its cosmic chest. The communication burst arrived without warning, a quantum-encrypted transmission that simultaneously existed and didn't exist until observed. Most communication systems would have collapsed under the paradoxical data stream. The Vorkax quantum receivers, considered the most advanced in known space, wavered for a microsecond, a duration that would have been imperceptible to any other species, but which felt like an eternity to Meltok. "Decryption protocols failing," she reported, her voice carrying an unusual note of professional frustration. "The transmission is adapting faster than our decryption algorithms." Captain Zrelnax watched the holographic display with a predator's intensity. The human vessel wasn't just sending a message, it was engaged in a complex dance of information that challenged the very concept of communication. Sub-Lieutenant Kravik, the ship's xenolinguistics specialist, leaned forward, his specialized neural implants, a marvel of Vorkax biotechnology, began to pulse with an erratic rhythm. Normally capable of processing 1,000 linguistic variations simultaneously, the implants were struggling to parse the incoming data. "It's not a standard communication," Kravik muttered. "It's more like a negotiation." The transmission resolved in fragments. Not words, exactly, but contextual packets of information that simultaneously conveyed multiple layers of meaning. Technical specifications, environmental data, a casual assessment of the surrounding spatial anomalies, and underneath it all, a subtext that read almost like an invitation. "To the vessel currently scanning our position," the message began, and even that simple phrase carried multiple simultaneous interpretations. Was it a warning? A greeting? A territorial declaration? Zrelnax recognized the linguistic complexity for what it was. A test. The human vessel's exterior began to shift subtly. Not a defensive posture, not an offensive stance. Something entirely different. Microscopic structures along its hull realigned, creating patterns that seemed to interact directly with the surrounding quantum instabilities. The Maelstrom cluster's most destructive forces were being managed, redirected, transformed. Meltok's sensor displays erupted with impossible data. The human ship was generating localized quantum stabilization fields that shouldn't have been mathematically possible. Gravitational shears that would have torn apart a standard vessel were being absorbed, redistributed, converted into potential energy. "They're not just surviving," Meltok whispered. "They're communicating with the environment." The transmission continued. Each word was a multi-dimensional construct that carried technical, emotional, and contextual information simultaneously. A human identifier, Captain Sarah Collins, accompanied the message. But it wasn't just a name. It was a comprehensive data package that included service records, psychological profiles, technical competencies, an entire life compressed into a quantum transmission. "We've been mapping this region for the past solar cycle," the message continued. "Your scanning protocols are interesting, but they're about 3 generations behind our current adaptive measures. If you're here to explore, we're happy to share data. If you're here to challenge our presence," a pause that carried multiple layers of meaning, "I'd recommend a comprehensive review of your tactical assessments." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was a professional courtesy. Kravik's neural implants began to overheat. The linguistic complexity was beyond anything in Vorkak's experience. This wasn't just communication. This was a form of existential negotiation that treated language as a living, adaptive entity. Captain Zrelnax felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of space exploration. Genuine, primordial curiosity. The human vessel continued its impossible existence. Quantum fields danced around its hull. Gravitational anomalies bent and twisted, transformed into something productive. The Maelstrom cluster, a region that had destroyed hundreds of exploration vessels, was being managed like a complex but solvable equation. And beneath it all, an unspoken message that would reshape everything the Vorkax understood about survival, adaptation, and the nature of intelligent life. They were no longer the most advanced species in the room. Not even close. The historical archives of the Vorkak civilization told a story of unrelenting adaptation. Krathmol, their homeworld, was not a planet. It was a living crucible of evolutionary pressure so intense that survival was a moment-to-moment negotiation with fundamental physical laws. Deep in the ship's memory cores, Holographic displays began to reconstruct the planetary history that had shaped their species. Geological records showed a world where tectonic plates moved with terrifying unpredictability. Atmospheric composition changed multiple times per local day. Radiation levels fluctuated between barely survivable and instantly fatal. Each Vorkax carried within their genetic memory the collective trauma of 1 billion generations of survival. The planet's primary continent, a massive landmass the size of 3 standard terrestrial planets, was a landscape of continuous geological warfare. Mountain ranges would rise and collapse within standard observation periods. Volcanic systems didn't just erupt. They engaged in complex chemical exchanges that rewrote entire ecological systems in moments. Zrelnax's personal genetic line traced back to the 13th adaptive cohort, a group of survivors who had developed a symbiotic relationship with the planet's most extreme radiation zones. His ancestral memories included genetic recordings of entire family units adapting in real time to environments that would vaporize most known life forms. But something about the human vessel challenged everything they understood about adaptive evolution. The ship's xenoanthropological database began to compile information about human origins. Earth, a planet that initially seemed unremarkable, revealed itself as another evolutionary pressure cooker. Unlike Krathmol's constant, violent transformations, Earth's challenges were more subtle, more insidious. Extreme temperature variations, predatory ecosystems, constant environmental migration. Technological development that accelerated faster than biological adaptation. Humans hadn't just survived. They had turned adaptation into an art form that transcended biological limitations. Sub-Lieutenant Kravek's specialized research modules began cross-referencing human historical data. The complexity was staggering. Where Vorkax evolution had been a linear process of physical adaptation, human evolution appeared almost fractal in its complexity. Biological adaptation, technological augmentation, cultural innovation. These weren't separate processes for humans. They were a single integrated system of continuous transformation. The Vorkax had believed themselves masters of adaptation, but humans seemed to view adaptation as a creative act, not just a survival mechanism. Archaeological records showed human civilizations that had transformed entire planetary ecosystems. They didn't just adapt to environments. They'd redesigned them. From agricultural revolutions to industrial transformations to emerging planetary engineering technologies, humans treated their environment as a collaborative partner rather than an obstacle. Meltok's sensor arrays continued to track the human vessel. Its adaptive capabilities went beyond biological or technological boundaries. The ship itself seemed to be a living system, continuously negotiating with the surrounding quantum environment. Each moment of observation revealed new layers of complexity. The Maelstrom cluster, a region that had destroyed hundreds of exploration vessels, was being treated by the human ship as nothing more than an interesting scientific problem. Not a threat, not a challenge. Simply a complex system waiting to be understood. Zrelnax felt something unprecedented stirring in his neural clusters. Not fear, not exactly respect. Something more fundamental. A recognition that the universe was far more complex than even the most advanced species had comprehended. The human vessel continued its impossible existence. Quantum fields danced around its hull like curious children. Gravitational anomalies bent and twisted, transformed into something productive. The most hostile region of known space was being managed with a casualness that bordered on the miraculous. And underneath it all, an unspoken message that would reshape everything the Vorkax understood about survival, adaptation, and the nature of intelligent life. They were no longer the most advanced species in the room. Not even close. The evolutionary game had changed, and humans were writing entirely new rules. The moment of true contact was nothing like any first encounter in galactic records. Quantum entanglement sensors on the Nightrender began to register patterns that defied standard communication protocols. It wasn't just an exchange of information. It was a complex, multi-dimensional negotiation that simultaneously existed across multiple potential states. Lieutenant Kravek's neural implants overloaded, forcing an emergency system shutdown. The human communication was less a transmission and more a living, adaptive system that rewrote its own parameters with each microsecond of interaction. "We're detecting multiple simultaneous communication streams," Mel Tok reported, her voice a blend of professional calm and an underlying excitement. "It's as if the transmission is creating its own contextual framework as it propagates." The human vessel's external configurations continued to shift. Microscopic structures along its hull realigned with mathematical precision, creating interference patterns that actively managed the surrounding quantum instabilities. Where other vessels would have deployed shields, this ship was negotiating with the fundamental forces of the universe. Captain Zrelnax observed a phenomenon that challenged everything in Vorkak's first contact protocols. The human vessel wasn't preparing for conflict. It wasn't displaying defensive postures. It was analyzing. Continuously. Comprehensively. Spectral analysis revealed layers of complexity that bordered on the impossible. The ship's hull wasn't just a protective barrier. It was an adaptive membrane that processed environmental data in real time. Radiation levels that would have vaporized standard matter were being absorbed, analyzed, and potentially converted into usable energy. A secondary transmission began to resolve. Not a communication in any traditional sense, but a comprehensive data package that seemed to be offering, almost casually, a complete technical overview of the vessel's current status. Preliminary environmental assessment. The transmission began. Radiation levels at quantum cascade 0.7.3. Gravitational shear within acceptable operational parameters. Quantum entanglement matrix currently operating at 94.7% efficiency. It wasn't a report. It was an invitation to understanding. The Nitrender's most advanced sensor arrays struggled to process the incoming data. Each fragment of information carried multiple layers of meaning. Technical specifications intertwined with environmental observations. Potential scientific insights nestled alongside what appeared to be casual conversational markers. Zrelnax realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a technological exchange. It was a fundamental reimagining of interspecies communication. The human vessel's external configuration continued its impossible dance. Sections of the hull would momentarily become translucent, revealing complex internal structures that seemed to breathe and adapt in real time. Quantum stabilization fields flickered around the ship like living auroras, transforming the most hostile region of known space into something that resembled a collaborative research environment. "Structural analysis incomplete," Mel Tok muttered, "but preliminary data suggests the vessel is continuously redesigning its own internal architecture in response to environmental conditions." It was more than adaptation. It was evolution happening in real time. Sub-Lieutenant Kravek's emergency neural recalibration completed. When his systems came back online, he discovered something extraordinary. The human transmission had not just been a communication. It had been a comprehensive diagnostic and repair sequence for his own neural implants. The implications were staggering. The humans weren't just surviving in the Maelstrom cluster. They were treating this region of space, a zone that had destroyed hundreds of exploration vessels, as nothing more than an interesting scientific problem to be solved. Not a threat, not a challenge. Simply a complex system waiting to be understood. Zrelnax felt something unprecedented stirring in his neural clusters, a recognition that the universe was far more complex than even the most advanced species had comprehended. The boundary between technology, biology, and environment was becoming something fluid, something alive. The human vessel continued its impossible existence. Quantum fields danced around its hull with the complexity of a living organism. Gravitational anomalies bent and twisted, transformed into something productive and beautiful. And underneath it all, an unspoken message that would reshape everything the Vorkaks understood about first contact, survival, and the nature of intelligent life. They were no longer observing. They were being invited to understand. The internal communications of the human vessel revealed a complexity that defied conventional understanding of crew dynamics. What the Vorkax intercepted was less a standard shipboard dialogue and more a living, adaptive neural network of consciousness. Thermal gradients are stabilizing in Sector 3. A voice identified as Dr. Elena Rodriguez announced. Her tone carried the clinical precision of a research scientist and the casual familiarity of someone discussing a routine maintenance task. Another voice, identified as Commander Jack Harrison, responded with a multilayered communication that simultaneously addressed the thermal issue, cross-referenced historical mission data, and made what appeared to be a mild joke about the vessel's previous encounters with extreme environmental conditions. The Vorkax linguistic analysis systems struggled to parse the communication. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a collaborative problem-solving process that existed somewhere between spoken language, technical report, and abstract philosophical discourse. Kravik's specialized xenolinguistic modules began to break down the communication patterns. The human crew wasn't just operating a vessel. They were engaged in a continuous collective cognitive process that treated the ship as an extension of their collective intelligence. Contextual fragments began to resolve in the Nightrender's data cores. This wasn't a standard research mission. The vessel carried a hybrid crew of scientists, engineers, and what could only be described as cognitive architects. Their previous missions read like a catalog of impossibilities. Quantum mapping of unstable spatial regions, ecological reconstruction of radiation-scorched planetary systems, technological interventions in environments that should have been categorically uninhabitable. Dr. Rodriguez's personal file revealed a background that defied traditional academic categorization: quantum physics, exobiology, adaptive engineering. Her previous publications suggested she viewed scientific disciplines not as separate fields, but as interconnected systems of understanding. The ship's mission logs were even more revealing. They weren't exploring the Maelstrom cluster, they were engaging with it. Each moment of observation was simultaneously a scientific study, a technological interaction, and what could only be described as a form of environmental dialogue. Commander Harrison's psychological profile showed something equally extraordinary: traditional human performance metrics, stress responses, cognitive flexibility, problem-solving capabilities seemed almost quaint when applied to his actual operational history. He didn't just adapt to extreme environments. He seemed to communicate with them on a fundamental level. Meltok watched in professional fascination as the human vessel continued its impossible existence. The ship wasn't just surviving in the Maelstrom cluster. It was treating the entire region as a complex, living system waiting to be understood. Intercepted technical logs revealed a mission objective that went far beyond standard exploratory protocols. They were mapping quantum instabilities not just to understand them, but to develop adaptive technologies that could transform hostile environments into collaborative spaces. Quantum cascade in Subsector 7 is showing interesting resonance patterns. Dr. Rodriguez's voice noted. Jack, can you run a sympathetic frequency analysis? The response was a complex mathematical model that arrived almost before the request was completed. Not a simple calculation, but a comprehensive exploration of potential quantum interactions that suggested the crew's cognitive processes operated at a level beyond sequential thinking. The Vorkax began to understand that they weren't just observing a technological marvel. They were witnessing a fundamentally different approach to existence. For humans, the boundary between technology, biology, and environment was not a fixed line. It was a fluid, negotiable space of continuous transformation. Zrelnax felt something unprecedented stirring in his neural clusters. This wasn't just a first contact scenario. It was an invitation to reimagine the very concept of intelligent exploration. The human vessel continued its dance with the Maelstrom cluster. Quantum fields flickered around its hull like living auroras. Gravitational anomalies bent and twisted, transformed into something productive and beautiful. And underneath it all, an unspoken message that would reshape everything the Vorkax understood about scientific exploration, technological adaptation, and the nature of collective intelligence. They were no longer just observers. They were being challenged to expand their understanding of what was possible. The biological analysis systems of the Nightrender represented the pinnacle of Vorkak's scientific achievement. Capable of parsing genetic information at quantum resolution, they were designed to break down the most complex life forms into comprehensible data streams. They began to fail spectacularly when confronted with human physiological data. Dr. Sarah Collins' medical profile arrived not as a standard biological record, but as a living, adaptive document that seemed to rewrite its own parameters with each microsecond of observation. Traditional medical categorizations, cellular structure, genetic markers, metabolic processes, became fluid concepts when applied to human biology. Her genetic sequence was less a fixed blueprint and more a dynamic algorithm of potential adaptation. Specialized nanoscale sensors detected something unprecedented. The human crew's cellular structures weren't just resilient. They were conversational. Each cell appeared to maintain a complex network of communication that extended beyond traditional biological boundaries. Immune responses, metabolic processes, neural interactions, all existed in a state of continuous negotiation. Sub-Lieutenant Kravek's analysis modules began to construct a comprehensive model. Humans didn't just adapt to environmental challenges. Their entire biological system was an ongoing process of adaptive reconfiguration. Standard medical scanning protocols revealed layers of complexity that bordered on the incomprehensible. Cellular structures that could rapidly reconfigure in response to environmental stressors. Neural networks that continuously rewrote their own operational parameters. Metabolic processes that transformed potentially harmful radiation into usable energy. Immune responses that treated external challenges as opportunities for systemic improvement. The crew's medical history was a testament to biological innovation. Previous mission logs showed exposure to environments that should have been instantly fatal. Radiation levels, gravitational stress, toxic chemical interactions. Each encounter was treated not as a threat, but as a complex problem to be solved. Dr. Rodriguez's personal medical file was particularly revealing. Genetic markers suggested multiple adaptive interventions, not through traditional genetic engineering, but through a process that seemed more like a dialogue between biological potential and environmental challenge. Zrelnax watched the data streams with a growing sense of professional fascination. This wasn't just a different approach to survival. It was an entirely new paradigm of biological existence. The human vessel continued its impossible dance with the Maelstrom cluster. Quantum fields flickered around its hull like living auroras. Gravitational anomalies bent and twisted, transformed into something productive and beautiful. Meltok's sensor arrays detected something extraordinary. The crew's biological systems weren't just surviving. They were actively engaging with the surrounding environment. Each moment of exposure was simultaneously a defensive response, a data collection process, and a potential avenue for systemic improvement. Commander Harrison's physiological data suggested he had survived multiple exposure events that should have been instantly fatal. But survival wasn't the right word. He had transformed those experiences into biological potential. The Vorkaks began to understand that they were witnessing something far beyond traditional biological adaptation. Humans didn't view their environment as a threat to be defended against. They saw it as a complex system to be understood, negotiated with, and potentially transformed. Kravek's neural implants struggled to construct a comprehensive model. The human biological approach defied every known principle of evolutionary adaptation. It wasn't survival of the fittest. It was survival through collective, adaptive intelligence. Layers of complexity continued to resolve. The crew's biological systems weren't just resilient. They were creative. Each environmental challenge was an opportunity for systemic reimagining. Zrelnax felt something unprecedented stirring in his neural clusters. This wasn't just a biological marvel. It was an invitation to reimagine the very concept of life itself. The intercepted data suggested a fundamental truth that would reshape everything the Vorkaks understood about biological potential. Humans didn't just survive in extreme environments. They became them. And underneath it all, an unspoken message that would challenge everything known about biological adaptation, technological potential, and the nature of intelligent life. They were no longer just observing a different species. They were being challenged to expand their understanding of what was possible. The first direct communication was nothing like any first contact protocol in galactic archives. Captain Sarah Collins appeared on the Nightrender's primary communication interface, not as a static transmission, but as a dynamically rendered holographic representation that seemed to adjust its own parameters in real time. Her image wasn't just a visual communication. It was a comprehensive data package that simultaneously conveyed verbal, visual, and contextual information. "We've been monitoring your approach for approximately 47 standard minutes," she began, her voice carrying a precision that suggested multiple layers of meaning. "I appreciate your thorough scanning protocols. They're several iterations more comprehensive than the last exploratory mission we encountered." The communication itself was a marvel of linguistic engineering. Each word carried multiple simultaneous translations, contextual nuances, and embedded technical specifications. It wasn't just a language. It was a living, adaptive communication system. Zrelnax's communication protocols struggled to process the transmission. Where most first contact scenarios involved careful diplomatic maneuvering, this felt more like a collaborative research discussion. "Your quantum entanglement sensors," Collins continued, "show some interesting calibration approaches. We got some comparative data from our recent Andromeda boundary studies that might be useful for your research team." It was an offer of scientific collaboration delivered with the casualness of sharing lunch recommendations. The Nightrender's cultural interface specialists found themselves in uncharted territory. This wasn't a diplomatic exchange. It was a comprehensive knowledge transfer that treated interspecies communication as a mutually beneficial scientific endeavor. Commander Jack Harrison appeared alongside Collins, not as a secondary figure, but as an integrated part of the communication matrix. His presence added additional layers of contextual information, geological survey data, quantum stability readings, and what appeared to be a running internal dialogue about the most efficient communication protocols. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's scientific annotations began to stream alongside the primary communication, creating a multi-dimensional information landscape that defied traditional communication models. Technical specifications intertwined with observational notes. Potential research collaborations emerged as natural extensions of the initial contact. The Vorkax began to understand that this wasn't just a first contact scenario. It was an invitation to a fundamentally different approach to interspecies interaction. "We've been mapping this region for the past solar cycle," Collins explained, her tone suggesting they were discussing a routine research expedition rather than navigating one of the most dangerous regions of known space. "Your approach vectors and quantum stabilization techniques show some fascinating technological divergences from our previous encounters." It was a statement that simultaneously served as a scientific observation, a diplomatic greeting, and a potential avenue for collaborative research. Kravik's sinolinguistic modules worked overtime, trying to parse the multiple layers of communication. The humans weren't just sharing information. They were creating a dynamic, collaborative knowledge space that treated interspecies communication as a fluid, adaptive process. The communication continued to unfold. Technical specifications danced with cultural context. Scientific observations intertwined with what seemed like casual conversation. Each moment of the transmission was a complex negotiation of knowledge, potential, and mutual understanding. Zrelnax realized they were experiencing something unprecedented. This wasn't a first contact scenario limited by traditional diplomatic constraints. This was an invitation to a fundamentally different approach to understanding. The human vessel continued its impossible existence. Quantum fields flickered around its hull like living auroras. Gravitational anomalies bent and twisted, transformed into something productive and beautiful. Commander Harrison's additional commentary provided context that went far beyond standard communication protocols. Previous mission logs, Potential research collaborations, comparative data from other exploratory missions. Each fragment of information was a comprehensive invitation to understanding. We've got some interesting quantum cascade data from our previous sector mapping, Dr. Rodriguez added, her voice carrying the excitement of a researcher who saw every challenging environment as an opportunity for discovery. I think you'll find our methodological approach quite intriguing. And underneath it all, an unspoken message that would reshape everything the Vorkax understood about first contact, scientific exploration, and the nature of intelligent communication. They were no longer just receiving a transmission. They were being invited to participate in a fundamentally new way of understanding the universe. The final moments of first contact were nothing like any recorded encounter in galactic archives. As the Nightrender's data cores processed the comprehensive transmission from the human vessel, something extraordinary began to happen. It wasn't just an exchange of information. It was a fundamental restructuring of understanding itself. Captain Zrelnax experienced what could only be described as an intellectual epiphany. The humans weren't presenting themselves as conquerors. They weren't establishing territorial boundaries. They were sharing, in the most fundamental sense of the word. The data streams revealed a civilizational approach that defied every known model of scientific and cultural expansion. Humans didn't view the universe as a territory to be conquered or a resource to be exploited. They saw it as a complex, interconnected system of potential, a living puzzle waiting to be understood. Dr. Rodriguez's final transmission contained something unprecedented. It wasn't just scientific data. It was a comprehensive invitation, a blueprint for collaborative exploration that treated interspecies communication as a dynamic, living process. Meltok watched in professional fascination as the human vessel began to transmit not just information, but potential. Complex mathematical models, technological schematics, ecological reconstruction strategies. Each data packet was an open-ended invitation to understanding. The Vorkax realized they were experiencing more than a first contact scenario. This was a fundamental reimagining of what intelligent exploration could mean. Commander Harrison's concluding notes provided context that went far beyond traditional scientific observations. Previous mission logs suggested an approach to exploration that treated every environmental challenge as an opportunity for collective growth. Dangerous regions weren't obstacles. They were invitations to understanding. Kravek's Sinolinguistic modules processed something extraordinary. The human transmission wasn't just communication. It was a living document of potential, a comprehensive approach to knowledge that treated information as a collaborative, adaptive entity. The philosophical implications were staggering. Humans didn't just explore the universe. They engaged with it as a partner. Every challenging environment was an opportunity for mutual understanding. Every potential conflict was an invitation to collaborative problem-solving. The Maelstrom Cluster, a region that had destroyed hundreds of exploration vessels, was being treated as a complex scientific opportunity. Not a threat to be conquered, not a resource to be exploited, but a living system waiting to be understood. Zrelnax felt something unprecedented stirring in his neural clusters. This wasn't just a technological marvel. It was a fundamental challenge to everything the Vorkax understood about intelligent life. The final transmission contained something that would reshape galactic understanding for generations to come. It wasn't a declaration of superiority. It wasn't a territorial claim. It was an open invitation to a different way of existing. Collaborative potential, mutual understanding, continuous adaptation. The human vessel began to prepare for its next phase of exploration, not as a conqueror, not as a visitor, but as a participant in a larger, more complex universal ecosystem. Quantum fields danced around its hull like living auroras. Gravitational anomalies bent and twisted, transformed into something productive and beautiful. The most hostile region of known space became a collaborative research environment. Captain Sarah Collins' final communication was both a conclusion and a beginning. We're mapping the next sector. Interested in joining the research? It wasn't a question. It was an invitation to a fundamentally new way of understanding existence. The Vorkax had entered the encounter believing they were the ultimate survivors. They were leaving with something far more valuable. A new perspective, a recognition that the universe was far more complex, far more beautiful, and far more collaborative than they had ever imagined. The Nightrender's data cores continued to process the transmission. Each moment revealed new layers of complexity. Each fragment of information was an invitation to growth. And underneath it all, an unspoken message that would challenge everything known about intelligent life, scientific exploration, and the nature of understanding itself. They were no longer just observers. They were participants in a universe of infinite potential.